This week, we have a very special guest joining us, Lyle Trytten, the Manager of Development for Giga Metals. Lyle has over 25 years of experience in the nickel industry, as well as other base metal projects on 5 continents, including copper, cobalt, and zinc. Currently, Lyle is overseeing all aspects of the development of Giga Metals' Turnagain nickel-cobalt sulfide deposit in northern British Columbia, where the team's working to turn a world-class deposit into a major long-life mine, responsibly supplying battery metals to the world. On this episode, Lyle and I cover Nickel 101. How is it used and why do we care? Lyle takes us through the 2 types of nickel deposits, how nickel is used in the rapidly expanding electric vehicle battery space, and my favorite part of this episode, how does carbon sequestration actually work in nickel mining, and why does it seem like it's gone from science fiction to reality in such a short period of time? I learned a ton during this episode, so I'm excited to share it with you and hear what you think if you leave us a review. Also, an important shout out to Lyle's drink of choice for this episode, Growlery Beers Golden Pear Ale, and mine, Ron Zacapa Rum from Guatemala. Both great choices to sip on as you dive in deep to learn more about nickel and the magic science of carbon sequestration in rocks. Let's jump in. All right, Lyle, thank you so much for joining us on the rocks today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Emily. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. And of course, we got to start off with what are you drinking today?
Well, I happen to live in an area that's had 2 breweries open within a kilometer of my house in the last 3 years, so it's pretty great. I'm a beer fan and a wine fan. Today, I've got a golden pear ale from a local brewery called the Growlery that does a great job with fruit-forward ales. They're just lovely, refreshing summer drinks.
Awesome. And do they sell them as growlers?
Growlers and cans. Usually I buy a growler because then I can have as much as I want. So small glass today, maybe more later.
Awesome. Well, today I'm shaking it up a little bit and I am drinking rum, believe it or not a bourbon or a whiskey. A good friend of mine gave me a bottle of Ron Zacapa rum, which is from Guatemala. And I'm not a rum fan usually. Most folks have a certain alcohol they had a bad experience with in college, and rum was mine. So I've kind of stayed away from it, even living in South Florida, other than like mojitos and stuff. But this one is really good. And I just love that, they reference the high altitude that the rum is aged in oak barrels, which I'm not, again, really sure what impact that has, but it's up in the mountains of Guatemala for some reason, and it's delicious. It's actually the first rum I've ever found that I can drink on the rocks. So,
Nice.
So that's what I'm drinking today. Well, I am really excited to dive into this with you today and talk in particular about how nickel projects can be a carbon sequestration, opportunity and a way to kind of bring net zero or carbon efforts into the mining industry and the chemistry behind that and the science behind it. But real quick, could you just give the listeners kind of a nickel 101? Like, why do we care about nickel? Why is it important right now? And what are maybe some key terms that folks should be familiar with if they're looking at a nickel company?
Sure. So, nickel has been an important metal for 100 years now since the advent of stainless steel. That's the dominant market today. 2/3, 70% of nickel goes into the stainless steel market. If you have stainless steel dishes in your cutlery in your kitchen and a stainless steel front in your dishwasher, it's probably containing nickel. Not all stainless steels do, but the best performing ones do. These are the 300 series stainless steels. Also used in alloys for high temperature applications, things like that, gas turbines and things. But, all the buzz about the nickel industry today is really about the lithium-ion batteries. So although all those traditional uses of nickel are continuing to be growing markets, the lithium-ion battery space is really taking off and is forecast to be a huge part of the nickel demand in the coming decade as we seek to decarbonize the world. So it's a really exciting opportunity. But the nickel industry is a little different than most metals industries in that nickel is made in 2 primary forms. So when you think about most metals, if you're thinking about zinc, copper, these are made as pure metals by electrolytic methods, and they're used as pure metals. So zinc, pure metal, used for galvanizing; copper, pure metal, used for wiring and plumbing and things like that. Nickel, because much of it is used in stainless steel, there's actually a very large trade in nickel alloys, low-grade nickel alloys, 8 to 30% nickel in iron that can go directly into stainless steel manufacturing. And that's great. You don't need to go to all the trouble of making class 1 or pure nickel metal to make stainless steel. You can do it with impure forms. That lowers the cost, lowers the environmental impact compared to taking that same nickel source all the way to a pure metal and then diluting it back again with chromite ores and other sources to make stainless steel. But for the battery market, we need that pure nickel. And what we see is that there's two dominant nickel sources in the world: nickel sulfides, nickel ores with sulfur as a part of the mineral content, which are almost exclusively converted into class 1 or refined or pure nickel that's used in batteries and other uses like the high nickel alloys, and some in stainless steel because you can't completely eliminate it. And then there's laterite nickel, oxide forms of nickel, whether they're in clays or other silicate rocks or in goethite, which is an iron mineral, where the nickel can be recovered to an alloy form fairly easily, metallurgically speaking, not without its environmental impacts, that goes into that stainless market. And so these two dominant methods of making nickel lead to two different products that go into two different uses. And what we've seen in the last decade is that most of the growth in the nickel market, really the last 20 years, has been in this treatment of nickel oxide ores to make low-grade nickel iron alloys for stainless steel. Great, we need that. But that isn't going to by itself solve the conundrum for electric vehicle manufacturers that want high nickel batteries that give the best energy density and best range for their vehicles.
And the deposits, the two types of nickel, are also typically found in different parts of the world also, right? The laterites are concentrated kind of around the equator, essentially.
Yeah, we have what we talk about as the laterite belt, which roughly, is an equatorial region. It goes a little further north into southern Russia and kind of area, trails a little further south in through Australia. And the nickel sulfides tend to be in the global north and south. And there's very few countries that actually have deposits of both nickel laterites and nickel sulfides. Australia does, Brazil does, but that's about it. Generally speaking, it's one or the other, as far as we know the deposits today.
And Lyle, when it comes to the electric vehicles and the batteries, like how is the nickel actually involved in the battery? Like what part of the battery is nickel critical to?
Yeah, so the nickel is in the cathode part of the battery. So both the cathode and the anode perform a very similar function. They have to store lithium ions and then release them in either the charge or the discharge cycle. So the cathode active materials, there's two primary forms of lithium ion batteries on the market today. One is LFP, lithium iron phosphate, which uses iron-based batteries, lower energy densities in general, but they work. And then there's high nickel batteries, nickel, manganese, cobalt, and nickel, cobalt, aluminum. And now there's another one, NCMA, nickel, cobalt, manganese, aluminum, that hold the lithium ions into a matrix of these metal oxides. So nickel and cobalt and manganese oxides all mixed together form this cathode material that holds the lithium ions at a much higher density. So this gives you a higher energy density in watt hours per kilogram or watt hours per liter of space that allows you to put effectively more power into a smaller battery and give you bigger range on an electric vehicle. Not really. A lot of these NMC batteries have been used as well for energy storage systems, like grid storage type batteries. It's not really the best use of that nickel. I'd rather see them in the vehicles. There's no real limitation on size and weight for a grid storage battery that's going to sit in a container at a substation. But they have been used that way as well. But that, future, that's probably not the biggest use. But for electric vehicles, certainly any high range vehicles, you're going to be looking towards nickel batteries. A small commuter car in the city that's only going to run, a couple hundred kilometers, you don't really need a nickel-based battery for that. And so there's room for both types of batteries in the market, and we expect that they will both be significant shares of the battery market going forward.
I think it's one of the cool ways that I see geology or mining basically stepping over into chemistry, right? Like I think folks maybe underappreciate the level of chemistry that goes into mining and especially on the processing side. and then how the minerals are used, right? I mean, like it goes both ways. And I just really think it's so cool when you get down to that level, like the use of minerals is so impacted by the pace of innovation on a lot of these higher tech things. And I know for some other resources, folks are saying, yeah, it's cool and sexy right now, but the minute people come out with a new battery technology, nobody's going to need that anymore. And I wonder, is nickel sensitive to that at all? There's this idea that like there's going to be a magic battery that comes out that's totally different than what we have right now.
Yeah. So, there's always going to be change within the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
My background is as an extractive metallurgist. I've been fully immersed in the chemistry for a long time.
Yeah.
Batteries are a fast-moving space, but even so, within that, we really speak about two kinds of change. There's evolutionary change and there's revolutionary change. And what we've seen in the battery space is evolutionary change. We used to make NMC batteries at 1 part nickel, 1 part cobalt, 1 part manganese. And then they moved to 532s, slightly more nickel. Then they moved to 622s. And now we're moving to 811, and we're talking about going to 9.5.5. So even higher nickel, less cobalt, less manganese, because this gives you higher energy densities with less cobalt, which is got two problems. One, it's expensive, much more expensive than nickel. And two, it's been tagged with some unfortunate issues around sourcing of it and impacts from some of the mining sources in the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah.
That's caused people some concerns. You can operate good mines in those regions, but it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
So we're seeing this evolutionary change. Automakers and battery makers, once they set up a line, they want to use it.
Right.
So to go to a revolutionary change to an all new battery chemistry, that's often going to require effectively rebuilding a big chunk of the infrastructure you've just built. So it needs to be a significantly advantaged process to create that drive. These are not companies that like to change quickly. Why has Tesla been eating Ford and GM and others for lunch for a decade? Because they're slow to change. Car companies are slow to change. They're legacy manufacturers, and once they've decided on a battery formulation, they're going to stick with it, give or take some tweaks, for a long time.
Yeah.
Volkswagen has announced their battery approach. They're going to use 3 types of batteries: LFP in their entry-level commuter vehicles, manganese-based batteries that have not very much nickel in their mid-range vehicles, and then high nickel batteries in their long-range vehicles. GM has announced their battery platform, the Ultium batteries that they're going to make that are high nickel batteries. That's not going to change quickly or easily, so we don't see that being a significant threat. And in a growing market, there's room for more participants. So even if we bring on, for example, sodium-based batteries, they're going to go alongside, not replace lithium batteries, because we need them all, right?
Right.
We can't.
And they have different advantages than a nickel battery would have.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating. Yeah, because it's certainly the cutting edge, cool new stuff gets a lot of news, but it takes a lot of money to bring a new development into production, especially like you're saying at the scale that happens. And certainly that evolutionary change I would expect is within the time frame that you can adjust pipelines from a mining company perspective, right, of different resources and assets. So in potential investors in a mining company that's providing nickel or other battery metals, like shouldn't be concerned that they're going to wake up tomorrow and the nickel company is going to have no business because some new battery came out. That's not like a realistic concern.
Prices can change. That's the business we're in. Commodity prices always change, but demand is rising, and it's rising in all sectors. So you might see that some high-cost manufacturers or producers could go out of the business in a downturn. There's nickel facilities that, have been swing producers historically, where they operate, about 50% of the time. They run for a few years, shut down for a few years. That's not unknown in our business. It helps to balance the market.
Right. Now, something else that's, of course, top of mind for everyone in the industry is ESG and carbon reduction. And something I'm really interested to hear you talk through is how you can have a net zero carbon nickel mine. And like, I know I was talking to you a little while ago that probably even like 12 months ago, to me, the idea that a mining site or a production site could be a carbon sink just because of the rocks was like science fiction, frankly. Like, I mean, you kind of knew that, like, yeah, chemically, sure, like it's possible. But now it seems like everybody's talking about it and it's real, right? It's happening, it's coming out. And could you just kind of explain what that is and how it works to the listeners? Because I think it's fascinating how fast it's moving or appears to be moving. Maybe it actually is just visibility.
Yeah, well, certainly it has become a hot topic. But, in the quest to create the lowest carbon nickel mines that you can, you have to start upstream. You need to have low carbon operations in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
That means you need to be running off hydroelectric power or some other form of always on renewable power. Solar and wind are great as adjuncts to a diesel fired mine site to lower the carbon footprint, but they're not going to get you near zero. So, especially here in Canada, we've got some provinces with great low carbon grids, Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia, and Manitoba. Also, happen to be the homes of nickel mining and other hard rock metals mining in the country.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few other regions in the world that boast both great deposits and great hydroelectric grids, but there aren't very many of them, right? So it starts there. You need that low carbon electricity because that's a big part of your energy input. You need to think through how you're going to mine. Of course, if you have higher grades, that's going to help. You mine less rock. If you have lower grades, you mine more rock. So you need to think through that whole process. But at the end of it, with a number of potential nickel mines, you have this added benefit of the carbon sequestration, which really it's a process that goes on today. It's been going on for millennia. It's not because of the mining. It's just natural reaction of the atmosphere with these types of rocks where they're exposed to atmosphere. But when you have a big hard rock stuck up in the air, it reacts pretty slowly because there's not much surface area.
Mm-hmm.
You take that rock, you crush it, you grind it down to 100 microns, you get a lot of surface area that can now react. And that's really the difference that we see is that these natural reactions that go on today, once we go through the mining process, we create the opportunity for them to go on much, much, much faster than they do naturally today, simply by creating that surface area. And those rocks are actually not the rocks that we want, the minerals that we want that contain the nickel that become our product. They're the tailings. So it's ultramafic minerals like olivine, serpentine, brucite. A lot of these high magnesium minerals, very basic in nature, will react with the CO2 and suck it out of the air naturally, creating other minerals in the process. So you're sequestering carbon in a very permanent form. You're making magnesium carbonate out of this ultimately. It's kind of like limestone. It's going to sit there for, we call it geological eras, until that rock is subducted again or it's dunked in acid. It's not going to burn down like a forest. You can sequester carbon in plants. That's great until they burn. You can sequester carbon in soils. Great until they get tilled up or used for something else. So there's all these risks with carbon sequestration through a lot of the methods that are talked about frequently. The mineral carbonation approach, once you've got it sequestered, it's locked down. It's not going anywhere. You're not going to lose it to a fire or to somebody's changing practices. It's there as a mineral and it's going to stay there. So that's very attractive. The capacity of these rocks to hold CO2 is huge. We've done some test work at Giga Metals on our ores, and we could put 400 kilograms of CO2 into every ton of tailings if we used really intensive chemical processing techniques, high temperatures, high pressures, pure CO2. But that's all really expensive. So as a mining company, is your business mining to make nickel or is your business sequestering carbon?
Right.
We kind of want to stick to our core business. So there's the other avenue, instead of taking these active routes, we call them active sequestration, where you put a lot of effort and energy into making sure you can maximize the amount of CO2 you sequester, is passive sequestration. Do the least work possible to encourage as much as you can. So grind it as fine as you need for your minerals recovery, but that's your primary business. And then spread it out and let it react. And it's not then about the capacity that it has to hold CO2. It's about how much of it is exposed and what's the rate at which it reacts before it gets covered up by the next layer of tailings. If I wanted to build an infinitely sized tailings pond, I could spread my tailings a centimeter deep across half the world and sequester a lot of carbon. That has unfortunate impacts on, a number of other environmental parameters.
Tailings, yeah.
Yeah. So, not going to do that.
Right.
So you really need to think about it in terms of the rate of reaction and the available area for reaction more than the capacity. And that's the route that I think most mining companies will look at. We're not averse to partnering with a direct air carbon capture company that wants to make pure CO2 and needs a place to sequester it. We have minerals that we could make available to you, but it's not our core business. Right. So for any of the potential mines in this area that have the right minerals, we all have material that we could provide to somebody who was sequestering carbon or capturing carbon and wanted to invest in the intensive processing required to make sure that CO2 actually gets locked up. But you can't afford to do direct air carbon capture and then throw half of it away by doing an inefficient sequestration with minerals, right? That doesn't work for your economics. So, we look at it on the point of view when we've done our math on maybe we could be a net neutral nickel mine. It's around how much space do we have and what kind of reaction rates have we demonstrated in the lab. What you're actually going to get in the field is always going to be a little bit different, right? Mother Nature isn't always your friend. It might be wetter or drier or than you want or something, and the rates will differ and change over time.
So how do you have an idea as compared to the 400 kilograms of carbon dioxide per ton that you could do, hypothetically, right, the maximum? What would the process or the methodology that you're talking about using in a passive way, what is the capacity?
We would expect to get something like 1 kilogram per ton of tailings sequestered. Yeah. It might be a little bit more, it might be a little bit less, but it will be in that range. And if anybody wants to say they're going to sequester 10 or 15 kilos per ton, I'd like to see how they plan on doing that and the math behind it, because unless you invest in things as a chemical engineer, gas, liquid, solids transfer is, scrubbers and things like that. Like, it's all doable, but it comes with a cost. And it's a cost of capital equipment and more energy and more labor and more maintenance. And is that really worthwhile? Becomes the question.
So, and how long does that take? And how would that impact the actual tailings operations? Like, do you put down a layer and then you wait for a certain period of time to allow the reaction to take place, and then you go and do it again? Or how does that change like a standard tailings operation, if any? Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, so the reactions are fast. And Dr. Greg Dippel at UBC, who we've done most of our work with on passive sequestration, has done a great video demonstration where he puts what we call a CO2 flux chamber, basically a little tube sealed with a CO2 monitor in it. Stick that on top of some tailings, and you can watch the CO2 concentration in the air drop. Over minutes, it will drop by half.
Wow, really? That fast?
The reactions are that fast. What you find, though, in a chemical reaction area, though, is the minerals that are easiest to react, and then they get coated with the new mineral, and they're not as reactive anymore. And so your rate slows down unless you do something to reactivate it. So we've done, control samples where we just leave it and monitor it we've done samples now for 2 months at a time and see how the rates behave. And they're fairly steady over a month or two. They will decline over a long time period. But if you churn those samples up, just put a shovel in them and dig them up and refreshen the surfaces, the reaction rates go back up again for a couple hours, and then they drop down as the surfaces become coated, and you move into, instead of having something that's limited by the rate at which you can get CO2 to the surface, it's limited by the amount of minerals that are actually exposed to that. But because these are surface reactions, what's actually going on is you're dissolving magnesium out of one mineral, reacting it with CO2 and making a new mineral on the surface. And this has a tendency to bind mineral grains together. So we get a process we call cementation, where the particles are actually getting bound together. Depending on how much CO2 reacts, it can be really weak bonds, it can be strong bonds. There's been some test work out of British Columbia that has demonstrated some astounding strength levels with high degrees of carbonation, where it may not be cement like you walk on, but it is very hard material. And this is actually seen in things like old asbestos mines, which have the similar sort of minerals where, stacked dry tailings deposits are hard. They're not, just slumping down. They're hard walls of rock because they've been fully cemented. What we expect to happen in a real tailings management facility is you do a slurry deposition of tailings. These deposits tend to be low grade and need to be run at millions of tons a year, so they don't really lend themselves to, filtered tailings type approaches. You expose the minerals for a while, depending on the size of your tailings facility, a week to a month or 2 months before they get submerged again by another layer of tailings. And in that time, the particles will start to bind together. Reactions will continue after you submerge them, but very, very slowly. But all the while that they're continuing, they're adding some small amount of strength to that tailings deposit, which it doesn't mean that I do away with the tailings dam. Never going to do that. But it is going to, over time, reduce the risk of a tailings failure. If your dam were to fail, stronger materials are going to flow less than if they weren't bound together at all. How much of that? That's going to be really difficult to judge and model. We know it's real because we see it and Mount Keith is the best example of this. The Mount Keith mine in Western Australia has the same kinds of minerals. And their tailings facility, you can cut holes in it and it doesn't slump.
Wow.
Because the minerals are cemented together through this carbonation process. And there's some very good images of this in some of the papers that have been published on this. The work has been going on in this area for decades, but it's just become mainstream now. And in fact, here in Canada, it hit the CBC, our national broadcaster news, the week of June 27th as a mainstream news article. So It's kind of cool to see it actually going fully mainstream now.
That's so cool. So really, by implementing this, you kind of hit the ESG component in two ways, because you're reducing the carbon while you're also strengthening the tailings facility, which reduces risk to the population and the environment from a potential failure. That's really neat. Yeah. And how do you measure this as it goes on? Like, is there a way to measure what's going on throughout the depth of the tailing?
Absolutely. So there's really three ways that you can look at measuring this, and they're all very standard, well-known methods. But what we might choose to do in practice, I can't be sure yet. So, what we do in the lab, we tend to do what we call flux chamber measurements, where you take a little plexiglass pipe or plastic pipe, maybe 4, 6, or 8 inches in diameter. You plunk it into the top of the tailings. You seal it up with a CO2 monitor. The space that's inside, and you measure how much CO2 is getting pulled out. That gives you a rate of reaction. And if you do that over areas of your deposit and over time, you can get a really good idea of the rate of reaction across the whole deposit, across the whole year. You can do it in the winter and in the summer and see how it changes. That's one method. It works, well known, but it's going to be hard to implement on a large scale because you're not necessarily going to want to walk out to the middle of the tailings pond to take a sample. So there's another method. You can core the sample and measure the inorganic carbon content, the carbonate minerals. So you know what it is when you put it in. So for our deposit at Turnagain, it will be something like 0.1% inorganic carbon in carbonate minerals in there to start with. And you come back, say, a year later, and you take a couple of drill cores, and look, we have 0.4% now. We know how much CO2 has been sequestered because it's changed and it's measurable, and you can see it across the depth as well. And so we actually get depth profiles when we do it in the lab over 4 inches. You can see the difference in the carbon content of the sample, and that gives you a really good idea of how much you've sequestered as well. And then the other way is borrowing on what they do within the timber and agricultural industry. And we do a larger scale flux measurement where effectively you're measuring the CO2 in the atmosphere above the tailings pond and correlating that with temperature and wind velocity and humidity and other metrics to measure how much CO2 is being absorbed by the tailings pond. And they do this today in forests to measure uptake of CO2 by forests. Technology works really well over a large area, but if I was using that, I would want to back that up with, some coring data or some flux data or something, and have two independent measurements, I think will be where we'll end up in the end for measuring this.
Well, and I would just think, the coring data sounds like a really, robust data set, because being able to see it throughout the column also and really understand what's going on as the time goes on. But it's really neat to think about the fact that, you see a change in the carbon, right above the tailings facility, right? I guess it makes sense. That's what happens with trees, right? But it's just so neat to think about. And do you foresee that this is something that moving forward companies will start to report on, or should report on, if they're claiming that they're doing this type of stuff, or their deposit is friendly towards carbon sequestration? Because I know there's always the difference between kind of the marketing angle of what could be done versus what actually happens when something's operational.
Right. So, let's separate mine projects from operating mines for a second. Mm-hmm. In operating mines, it would be great if they were measuring and reporting on it. BHP is the largest operator in the space that has this right now with Mount Keith, and they're starting to look at this much more intensively as to both how to measure what they're getting and how to improve on it, how to increase the rate. There's a great article on this popped up this week by Samantha Langley that they're starting to look much more intensively at this, and that's great. The more that they can do to improve the rate of sequestration, the better off we all are as a globe. Fantastic, and they should be reporting on it. Whether they get offset credits for it or not is a side issue, perhaps. Right. There are credit mechanisms in the world, depending on where you are, voluntary and regulatory mechanisms, and you need to get protocols in place. I think we'll see those come over time, but that doesn't change whether you're sequestering carbon or not. It's just a matter of whether you can sell the credits, right? If you're doing it, you're doing it. And it's a natural process. For projects, I think it's the proponents of projects, the junior mining companies, or in some cases, more senior mining companies, should be really clear about what they're saying and what it means. If they're talking about the capacity of their minerals to hold CO2, great. Say that's a capacity and say what you expect to do about it. Because
that's where you could spread half the world with half a centimeter. Right? That would be the capacity as opposed to the actual planned rate.
I expect the world's biggest nickel resource is the ocean. So what?
Yeah.
Right? You come down to a so what?
Yeah.
If you can't use it, it doesn't matter. Right. And so, we've taken pains at Giga Metals to think through what's the likely actual outcome. So it's not about capacity, it's about rate, and it's about exposed area, and it's about what you can demonstrate. Ultimately, you won't actually know until you have it in the field, because it is very dependent on temperature, on moisture level of the tailings, on how much they're exposed. So if you submerge your tailings because you have some sulfides that want to react and create acid mine drainage, well, they're not going to carbonate very well.
Right, because they're not exposed to the air. They're in
exactly.
Yeah.
Right. What you really want is damp tailings exposed to the air, because the actual reaction happens in the water phase. CO2 dissolves in the water, makes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid reacts with the magnesium minerals to make the sequestered carbon minerals.
Okay.
So you need them damp, but not too wet, not too dry.
It's a Goldilocks, the Goldilocks tailings facility. Yeah.
Well, so if somebody tells you that they know how much they are going to sequester, and they're not actually running the tailings pond today, I don't think that they're being upfront about it.
Yeah. Right? Ask some clarifying questions.
That's right.
Yeah.
We take great care when we're presenting information publicly at Giga to be clear that this is a possibility. We could sequester this much. That's what our lab rates suggest.
Right.
But the practical reality may be different. And it could be better or worse depending on what we do. If we figure out ways to improve the reaction rate, it could be better.
Yeah.
If not, it'll be worse. We will always sequester carbon. The quantity is always the question.
Now, obviously, nickel is a great opportunity to kind of use this to reduce the carbon footprint of the industry. Are there other minerals that also work, or other types of mining projects that offer a similar benefit?
Within the base metals industry, I haven't come across anything that does this besides nickel ores. The types of rocks hosting the ores It's about the genesis of those. I'm not a geologist by background, so I don't really want to speak to the genesis of viable ore bodies. But certainly there are two other places where it is known today. Asbestos mining.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's not a growth industry.
Right.
Although it has been a big industry here in Canada in certain regions, including near where our Turnagain mine is. There's the Cassiar asbestos mine is not that far away. And all of these deposits, these ultramafic deposits, tend to host asbestiform or fibrous minerals in them as well to a very small degree. And you have to be careful about that.
Right.
The other one is in the diamond industry. We see some of the diamond mines are showing have the same minerals. And so I was in a session recently with some of the other junior mining companies in the nickel space, and Mountain Province Diamonds, who have a diamond mine that they're a part owner of in northern Canada, that has shown the same carbon sequestration.
Oh,
and so it's going on at Canadian diamond mines today.
Mm-hmm.
The minerals are a little bit different, but the distribution of how much olivine or serpentine or brucite or this or that or the next thing changes from mine to mine and within a mine from location to location. Mother Nature didn't just give us big pods that are exactly 100% uniform. Unfortunately, she's not the most friendly that way.
Yeah. Nice, easy squares like the
When you do your geometallurgical modeling, you come to understand the distribution of the minerals you can recover and the hardness of the ores and how much they're going to cost to process, and the presence of the minerals that really help to sequester carbon. And when we talk about passive carbonation, it's really the brucite that we talk about the most. It's the most reactive of the minerals. So it takes up most of the CO2 that we see taken up will all be in brucite because it is just far more reactive. Ultimately, in terms of ultimate capacity, serpentine and olivine will react eventually anyway, but it could be much longer than the mine life before you see any meaningful amount of reaction from those minerals because the brucite is there and available, and until it's gone, the CO2 isn't going to react with the other minerals.
So I kind of, as we talk through this, the high points that I kind of captured that folks should look for if they're interested in investing in this, right? If someone's coming into the mining industry and they're really passionate about, carbon reduction, and this sounds like a really good fit for them, they should be looking for a project that is in an area where hydropower is a significant component of the power supply to the project, a high grade deposit, right? And then look for where the company is talking about the rate of the carbon sequestration as opposed to just the capacity of the project. Are there any other key things they should be sure to ask about or look at?
Yeah, well, I'd like to touch on the grade aspect for a moment, Emily, because this is one thing that we've seen. You want deposits at surface as well because they take less energy than mining underground in where you have to hoist all the rock back up.
Right.
Typically what you see is your highest grade mines are underground mines because it's expensive mining, and you only mine the high grade ore because that's all you can afford to mine. And you mine lower grade ores at surface because you can afford to. And it would be great to go and discover a really high grade nickel mine on surface with close infrastructure and all the best ESG credentials. That'd be fantastic. If you find one, let me know. The last
find it on Prospector. No.
The last really significant surface high-grade nickel discovery was Voisey's Bay. And that's more than 20 years ago.
Yeah.
There's one good at-grade nickel, high-ish grade nickel deposit, at surface in Africa, Kabanga. Unfortunately, it's 1,200 kilometers from the coast and in a region that has historically been somewhat difficult to work in. So great deposit, shame about the location.
Right.
We have a lot of deposits that are much lower grade that are now being looked at seriously. So we've seen this evolution over the years in the nickel industry from these high grade deposits. Sudbury has some great deposits, Norilsk in Russia, great deposits. Thompson in Manitoba has had great deposits. And we've seen an evolution to lower grade and lower grade deposits over time, just like we see in the copper business. So, Mount Keith started up in Australia. It's a lower grade deposit. Kevitsa in Scandinavia started up. That's a lower grade deposit. And now we're looking at even lower grades. So these ultramafic nickel projects like Turnagain and like some of the other ones in Canada, Ronbacken in Sweden, these are much lower grade deposits. They're on the order of 0.25, 0.3% nickel. But when you think about this, it isn't actually the nickel grade in the ore that matters. It's how much of that nickel you can recover, because the nickel ends up being distributed between the silicate host rocks, like the olivine, and nickel sulfide minerals, like pentlandite, which you can recover. And when you look at a number of these deposits, you might find that they have varying head grades, but the same recovered nickel grade. And it's that recovered nickel grade that really matters. So for Turnagain, it's in the 0.1% range. Right? It's not high, but it competes with copper porphyry deposits. In a value per ton basis, it really looks like a copper porphyry.
Interesting.
You got to mine a lot of material to recover a little bit of nickel concentrate out of it. And 50% of the nickel is not in a recoverable form.
But you've got a large deposit typically to mine.
When you have that's right. When you have 1 billion tons and you can go at it at 30 million tons a year, you can actually make a substantial amount. But they don't lend themselves to small operations. You're not going to start a deposit like that with a 3 or 5 million ton per year mine, because there just isn't enough money to pay for it.
Well, and that's where as we always recommend to folks, like, you really have to do your research on, the other aspects of the company, right? The management team, their experience with similar projects, bringing them into production or running them, and, the financing structure and all that stuff becomes really important with a bigger project in particular, because you've got to go big or go home, essentially.
That's right.
For free. Right?
And most junior mining companies are never going to run a mine.
Yeah, true.
Right?
Yeah.
They're going to sell it, and a major mining company is going to build it and operate it.
Yeah. Yep. No, absolutely. And that's a unique thing, I think, about our industry that I continue to remind folks, that you can have an amazing junior who you don't evaluate them for whether they can bring it into production, because that's really probably not what they're great at and not what they're going to end up doing. Right.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I've learned a whole heck of a lot about this. This is really helpful. Thank you, Lyle. And I just, as I warned you, I've been asking all my guests at the end of the taping to share with us, if you could wave your magic wand and change one thing about the industry, the mining industry, what would you change and why?
So you've had some great responses to this over the past episodes, and I agree with many of them. Financing, diversity and inclusion, these are all really, really important factors for our industry. I've hired people into the mining industry for a lot of years. But for me, when I think about this right now, I think there's a structural disconnect, and it comes back to the financing side, where we're trying to create, especially for these battery minerals, the metals that create the new infrastructure that power our world, right? And these are forever, metals are forever. Yeah. You make nickel, you put it into a battery, 15 years later, it's going to come back out, get recycled, go back into the battery. These are like infrastructure projects more than they're like traditional resource exploitation projects. And for a lot of these larger new deposits like Turnagain, where you're looking at 30 plus year mine life, it's not like a gold deposit that might run 5 years, create a very high rate of return, but only for a limited time span. We're creating deposits and mines and projects that are generational in nature. And I worked for Sherritt for many years. I had 4th generation employees working for me. It's a very powerful thing. When we think about projects that have these long lives, I think we really need to be thinking about them a little bit differently on the risk profile than current projects, and really be encouraging institutional investors to take a look, right? Traditional investors especially in the junior mining sector, but even in the senior mining sector or the mine development area, are much more risk favorable and reward favorable. They want high returns and they're willing to take the risk. And institutional investors aren't like that. But when you're talking about a 30 or a 40-year project, this isn't the same risk level as a traditional mine project. It's more like an infrastructure project. It's more like building a power dam or a power line, where you're going to may generate a low rate of return for a very long time. And getting pension funds and other institutional investors excited about the mining industry and willing to support the development that we need in order to set about decarbonizing the world, which is a huge ask and a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
The money, there's trillions of dollars tied up in these funds that isn't being deployed. And there's
Right.
countries that are starving for capital. And the match seems obvious, but it's a risk appetite issue and a sectoral issue that I personally don't know how to solve, but I would love to see funds like the Canadian Pension Plan or the European pension funds coming into the space and saying this is strategically important.
Mm-hmm.
We have DoD involved in this now, right?
Yeah.
Strategically important for our economies. We want to ally shore. We want to produce domestically. These are all critically important matters, and we need to bring those large, stable sources of funding in to create the economic change that we're looking for in our countries. It's not about a project; it's about a whole sector of the economy.
No, I mean that is such an amazing connection, Lyle. I mean, I've never thought of it that way. As a mining investment can be an infrastructure investment, and you're right in so many different ways, especially in the same way investing in roads or power grids or any of that also creates a lot of other economic opportunity, right? I mean, you need that base level infrastructure investment in order to facilitate other types of economic activity. And that is so true about the mining industry as well, right? I mean, we mine the stuff that everybody else makes stuff out of, right? So I'm behind you on that magic wand. I don't know the answer either, but that's where the magic wand is magic. Right?
But if you look at how China has dominated the industry over the last 10 or 15 years, it's because of access to money, right? Yep. They've been willing to take whatever risk they perceive it to be to achieve their strategic goals. And in the West, we haven't been willing to. We've been willing to dump billions of dollars into tech startups that may never show a revenue, but you can't get money to build a mine.
Yeah, and also, I mean, their government has backed them, right? I mean, that's another key difference. The Chinese government has backed and supported those long-term investments. And I would say we're starting to see a little bit of that, right, in the U.S. and Canada and other countries, but certainly not at the same scale.
They're recognizing the problem. They haven't figured out the solutions yet. I would give a shout out, actually, though, to the Canadian Pension Plan and the Ontario, especially the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. They've been invested in the mining industry before. The Teachers Pension Plan in Ontario invested with Sherrod in buying a bunch of coal mines 20-some years ago.
Interesting.
And they were part owners of that for many, many years because they saw it as a viable long-term investment, right? Yeah. Because it's a coal mine. It's going to run for ages. Of course, now we're shutting them down. Fine. Right. I'm good with that. And the next wave is now the metal mines that will run for many, many decades.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on The Rocks, Lyle. I really look forward to following what you guys are doing at Giga and seeing how this progresses. And thanks so much for explaining all of this to us today.
You're very welcome, Emily. It's been a pleasure being here on The Rocks.
Look forward to
listening to the results.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers.